The heavy industrial door at the end of the north basement corridor didn't belong in a professional public high school. It was reinforced steel, painted a dull, institutional gray that seemed to swallow the flickering fluorescent light from the hallway ceiling. Sarah stood before it, her breathing shallow and controlled, her pulse a steady, rhythmic thrum in her ears. As a history teacher, she was supposed to be in the faculty lounge grading essays on the Reconstruction era, but the object she held in her hand had changed her afternoon plans. It was a silver locket, its delicate chains snapped, found snagged in the door's thick rubber gasket. Inside was a tiny photo of Maya Vance, a junior who had supposedly transferred 3 days ago without saying a single word to her friends. Sarah's thumb brushed over the metal. Her tactical training, a life she had buried under a beige cardigan and a quiet demeanor, screamed that something was wrong. In her former world, the federal world, people didn't just transfer, they were extracted or erased. The school legend was simple. The locked room was a remnant of a Cold War fallout shelter, and those who went in never came back. To the students, it was just a ghost story meant to keep them out of the basement. To Sarah, the lack of dust around the keyhole and the high-end biometric scanner hidden behind a sliding plastic plate suggested something far more terrestrial and dangerous. She looked up at the corner of the ceiling. The security camera was positioned to capture the hallway, but had a precise 4-degree blind spot right at the door's threshold. Whoever installed it knew exactly what they were doing. Sarah felt that old, familiar coldness settling in her chest. She wasn't just a teacher anymore. She was a hunter who had finally found a fresh scent in a very stale building. The basement air was thick with the smell of floor wax and something metallic, like ozone from a high-voltage server. She knelt, examining the floor. There were faint, parallel scuff marks on the linoleum, the kind made by heavy equipment cases, or perhaps a medical gurney. Maya Vance wasn't a runaway. She was a straight-A student with a scholarship path and a younger brother she adored. She wouldn't have left her locket behind. Sarah stood up, her eyes narrowing as she heard the distant echo of footsteps on the stairs. It was too rhythmic for a student, too heavy for the janitor. It was a deliberate, measured gait of someone trained to walk with purpose. She ducked into the shadows of a nearby utility alcove, pressing her back against the cool brick. A man appeared at the end of the hall. It was Miller, the school's head of security. He didn't look like a retired cop. He looked like an active-duty operator. He didn't check the other doors. He went straight to the steel door, his hand moving to the hidden scanner. Sarah watched the way he carried himself, the slight cant of his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned for threats. He wasn't guarding a school. He was guarding a perimeter. The door hissed open with a hydraulic sigh, and Miller stepped inside. Before the door could fully seal, Sarah saw a flash of blue light and a bank of monitors. Then silence returned to the basement. Maya hadn't left the state. She was still in the building, and Sarah knew that if she didn't act soon, the girl would become a permanent part of the school's dark history. The next morning, the sun bled through the high windows of the history department, but the warmth felt artificial to Sarah. She sat at her desk, her eyes fixed on a seating chart that now looked like a map of casualties. Maya's desk in the third row was empty, a gaping hole in the room's geography. Principal Thorne had made an announcement over the PA system about Maya's bright future at her new academy, his voice smooth and reassuring, dripping with the kind of practiced empathy that usually masked a sociopath. It was the kind of lie Sarah used to tell for a living when she worked in the field. After third period, a shadow fell over her desk. It was Leo, a rail-thin senior with dark circles under his eyes and a reputation for being the school's most talented, if troublesome, coder. He didn't say anything at first. He just dropped a crumpled piece of paper onto her lesson plan. "She didn't transfer, Miss Sarah," Leo whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "I hacked the administration's outgoing mail servers last night.
There's no transfer request for Maya Vance, no transcript sent, no records pulled by another district. On paper, she still goes here, but her attendance is being manually overridden by a remote IP address that doesn't belong to the school district. Sarah didn't react with surprise. Instead, she looked at Leo with a piercing intensity that made the boy flinch. She saw the raw fear in him, but also the desperate need for the truth. She realized then that Leo wasn't just a curious student, he was Maya's closest friend and probably her only hope. "Leo, you need to be very careful with where you dig," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding register that didn't match her quiet teacher persona. "The people involved in this aren't just school administrators. They are professionals with resources you can't imagine. If they catch you in the system, they won't give you detention. They will erase you." Leo stared at her, noticing for the first time that his history teacher had the eyes of a soldier. He nodded slowly, sliding a small encrypted USB drive toward her across the wooden desk. "I tracked the IP. It's coming from the basement server room, but there's a secondary firewall I can't crack. It's military grade. Why does a public high school have a sub-level server that requires a 256-bit encryption key just to look at the power logs?" Sarah took the drive, her fingers brushing the plastic. "Go to class, Leo. Don't look at the basement cameras. Don't mention this to anyone, not even the guidance counselor, especially not the counselor." She watched him leave, her mind already analyzing the new data. If the school was hosting a black site server, it meant the basement room wasn't just a storage area, it was a node in a much larger network. This wasn't local corruption. This was an operation using the school's infrastructure as a mask for something international and well-funded. She needed to get back into that basement, but she couldn't go through the door. She needed a different way in. She thought back to the school's blueprints she had memorized years ago when she first took the job as a cover. There was a ventilation shaft in the old theater wing that bypassed the main hallway sensors. It was tight, it was dirty, and it was exactly the kind of entry point the security team would overlook because they assumed no one on the teaching staff was capable of using it. At 11 p.m., Oak Ridge High was a tomb of glass and steel, illuminated only by the ghostly green glow of exit signs. Sarah moved through the darkened auditorium with the silent, practiced grace of a ghost. She had traded her wool cardigan for a black tactical turtleneck and cargo pants, her hair pulled back tight in a functional knot. She reached the ventilation grate behind the heavy velvet curtains of the stage, where the dust of decades had settled. With a specialized multi-tool she had retrieved from a hidden floorboard in her apartment, she unscrewed the bolts in seconds, placing them silently on a piece of soft cloth. She slid into the narrow duct, the smell of stale air and galvanized metal filling her lungs. Every movement had to be precise. A single loud thud against the tin would echo through the vents like a drum in the silence. The duct sloped downward at a steep angle, and the temperature began to drop as she moved deeper toward the foundation. She reached a junction where the air turned cold and hummed with the vibration of high-powered cooling fans. She peered through a vent cover and looked down into a room that didn't exist on any official school map. It was a clean room, white-walled and filled with racks of servers that pulsed with rhythmic blue lights. In the center of the room, Principal Thorne and Mrs. Gable, the school counselor, were standing over a large table covered in digital tablets. They weren't discussing curriculum or the upcoming prom. They were looking at student profiles, dozens of them, all marked with red selection icons that looked like target reticles. "The shipment for the Vegas hub is behind schedule," Gable said, her voice cold and devoid of its usual empathetic tone. Vance was a perfect match for the demographic, but the extraction was messy. She fought back more than the psychological profile suggested. Miller had to sedate her twice. Thorne sighed, rubbing his temples as if he were dealing with a minor administrative error. Just ensure the paperwork is clean. We can't have another missing person report hitting the local news. The school's reputation is our primary shield. As long as parents think their kids are at elite academies or abroad, we are invisible. How many more do we need for the quarter? Sarah felt a surge of cold fury. This wasn't just a cover-up, it was a human trafficking pipeline. They were using the school's troubled youth or high achiever programs to identify vulnerable students, then faking their transfers to sell them into high-end labor or worse. She shifted her position to get a better view of the tablets, but her sleeve caught on a jagged piece of metal inside the duct. The sharp rasp of fabric against steel was quiet, but in the sterile silence of the server room, it sounded like a gunshot. Below, Thorne stopped mid-sentence. His head snapped upward, his eyes scanning the ceiling. Sarah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she didn't hold her breath. That was a rookie mistake that led to an audible gasp. She waited, perfectly still, as Thorne's eyes lingered on her vent. After an eternity, Miller entered the room, his hand on his sidearm. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Thorne looked away from the vent. "Just the building settling. Check the perimeter anyway. I want the Vance girl moved to the transport van by midnight. We're done here."
As soon as the room cleared and the hydraulic door hissed shut, Sarah moved. She popped the vent cover and dropped 10 feet to the floor, landing in a crouch that absorbed the impact without a sound. She had exactly 3 minutes before Miller's patrol brought him back to the sector. She sprinted to the central console, her fingers flying across the keyboard with muscle memory that had never truly left her. She didn't try to crack the main firewall. Leo had already said it was military grade. Instead, she targeted the local peripheral logs, the bridge that connected the servers to the school's internal Wi-Fi. It was a vulnerability she had exploited a dozen times in her previous life. She plugged in Leo's drive, bypassing the encryption by using a hardware-level override that forced the system to recognize her device as a diagnostic tool. The screen flickered, and a directory appeared in a harsh white font: Project Horizon. She opened the file for Maya Vance. It contained a full psychological profile, biometric data, and a digital scrubbing checklist. They had already deleted her social media, redirected her mail, and sent a spoofed video message to her parents using a sophisticated deepfake of her voice. It was a professional-grade disappearance. Sarah's eyes scanned the other names in the directory. There were 34 students listed over the last 2 years. Some were marked archived, while others were in transit. She felt a sick realization. The locked room wasn't just a legend. It was a processing center. These kids weren't just being sold, they were being repurposed for various illegal operations, and the school was the perfect camouflage. She found a folder labeled Exit Logs. It contained GPS coordinates for a warehouse near the old industrial docks, 10 miles from the school. That had to be the staging area where Maya was being held before the shipment. She initiated a full download of the directory, the progress bar mocking her with its slow crawl. 10%? 20%? She looked at the door. The red light on the electronic lock began to pulse. Someone was attempting to enter from the other side. She didn't have time to finish the download. She grabbed the drive, but as she pulled it out, she noticed a physical ledger tucked under the server rack. It was an old-fashioned notebook, the kind used for handwritten records. She flipped it open. The handwriting was Thorne's. It wasn't just names and dates. It was a list of payments. The money wasn't coming from private buyers. It was coming from a shell company Sarah recognized with a jolt of terror: Aegis Strategic Solutions. They were a private intelligence contractor Sarah had investigated 5 years ago, right before she was forced into hiding. This wasn't a local ring. It was a corporate-funded operation. The school wasn't just a hub, it was a farm for training or selling assets. The door's lock clicked. Sarah didn't head back to the vent. It would take too long to climb. She dived behind a heavy server rack, pressing herself into the narrow space just as the door swung open. Miller walked in, his eyes immediately darting to the console. He saw the "access granted" message still glowing on the screen. He drew his weapon, his voice a low growl. "We have a breach. Lock down the building." Sarah didn't wait for Miller to find her. She knew the layout of the room now, and she knew the guards' patterns. As Miller stepped toward the console, she slid out from the other side of the rack, staying low and using the hum of the cooling fans to mask her movement. She didn't engage. She couldn't afford a fight yet. She slipped through the open door and into the dark hallway, moving toward the stairs. She needed to get back to the main level and act like a confused teacher before they locked down the entire building. She reached the history wing, changed back into her cardigan in the dark of her classroom, and sat down at her desk. She turned on her desk lamp and opened a stack of papers, just as the lights in the hallway flared to life. 5 minutes later, there was a sharp, aggressive knock on her door. Principal Thorne stood there, flanked by Miller, who looked like he was ready to kill. Thorne's face was a mask of professional concern, but his eyes were cold and predatory. "Miss Sarah," he said, stepping into the room without an invitation. "It's quite late for grading, isn't it? The security alarm in the basement was tripped. Miller here said he thought he saw someone in the north wing." Sarah looked up, her expression a perfect blend of fatigue and mild surprise. She adjusted her glasses, a prop she used to soften her sharp features. "I'm sorry, Principal Thorne, I didn't hear any alarm. I've been here since 7. These junior essays are, well, they require a lot of attention." Thorne walked to her desk, his hand resting on the stack of papers. He was looking for any sign of sweat, any tremor in her hands. Sarah didn't give him anything. She had undergone interrogation resistance training that would make Thorne's tactics look like a playground game. "You're very dedicated," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave. "But I noticed your car wasn't in the staff lot when I arrived an hour ago. Miller checked." Sarah smiled thinly, looking him in the eye. "I parked in the student lot near the theater. My radiator has been leaking and I didn't want to stay in the new asphalt in the faculty section. Is something wrong? You look worried." The silence in the room was heavy. Miller stepped closer, his hand hovering near his belt. He was looking at Sarah's boots. She had wiped them down, but a tiny speck of white dust from the basement ceiling remained on the toe of her left shoe. Thorne followed Miller's gaze. The tension was a physical weight. Sarah realized she was 1 second away from having to drop both of them. She shifted her weight, her muscles coiling for a strike. Then the school's fire alarm began to blare. Thorne and Miller both jumped. "What now?" Thorne hissed. He looked at Sarah, then at Miller. "Stay with her," he ordered Miller. "I'll check the panel." As Thorne turned, Sarah felt a surge of relief. Leo had come through. He had triggered the alarm from a remote location to give her an out. But she wasn't safe yet. Miller was still staring at her, and his hand was no longer hovering. He was drawing his gun, his eyes filled with a sudden, violent realization. "Stand up, Miss Sarah. Hands where I can see them," Miller commanded, his voice devoid of any pretense. The fire alarm continued to shriek, a chaotic backdrop to the standoff. Sarah didn't panic. She stood up slowly, her hands raised to shoulder height. "Miller, what is this? You're scaring me," she said, maintaining the facade. But Miller wasn't buying it. He stepped forward, the muzzle of his suppressed Glock aimed at her chest. "I know a professional when I see one. The way you move, the way you didn't flinch when that alarm went off. You're not a teacher. Who are you working for? CIA? Mossad?" Sarah's eyes flickered to the heavy metal stapler on her desk. "I'm a history teacher, Miller. I work for the school district." Miller smirked, reaching for his handcuffs. "We'll see about that in the basement." This was the moment. As Miller reached out, Sarah moved with a speed that defied her appearance. She parried his arm with a sharp, upward strike, redirecting the weapon. In the same motion, she drove her palm into his chin, snapping his head back. Before he could recover, she gripped his wrist and twisted, the gun clattering to the carpet. She followed up with a clinical strike to the solar plexus, folding him in half, then a knee to the face. Miller went down hard, unconscious before he hit the floor. She didn't waste time. She grabbed the gun, checked the chamber, and tucked it into her waistband. She needed to find Mrs. Gable. If Thorne was the muscle and the architect, Gable was the one who managed the merchandise. She ran toward the guidance office, the fire alarm finally cutting out, replaced by a haunting silence. She kicked in Gable's door. The office was empty, but the computer was still logged in.
Sarah searched the physical files, tearing through the confidential student records cabinet. She found a hidden compartment in the back of the bottom drawer. Inside was a stack of burner phones and a series of exit packets for students who hadn't even transferred yet. One packet was for Leo. Sarah's heart sank. They knew he was helping her. She saw a note clipped to the front. Insubordination/digital breach. Extraction set for 0015. She looked at her watch. It was 12:10 a.m. She had 5 minutes. She checked the security feed on Gable's monitor. She saw a black van pulling up to the back loading dock near the gym. 2 men in tactical gear were pulling a struggling figure out of the school. It was Leo, his head covered by a black hood. Behind them, Gable was calmly checking her watch. Sarah realized the locked room wasn't just a place to hide things. It was the start of a journey no one returned from. She had to stop that van, or she would lose both Maya and Leo. She snatched a burner phone and a set of keys and ran toward the gym.
Sarah raced through the darkened hallways toward the gym, her mind working like a high-speed processor. She couldn't just go out the front doors. Thorne's men would have the perimeter covered. She took a shortcut through the library, vaulting over the circulation desk with ease. As she ran, she pulled out one of the burner phones she'd swiped from Gable's office. It vibrated in her hand. A text message appeared from an unsaved number. Package 1 loaded, moving to secondary site. Package 2, Vance, in transit. Sarah realized Maya was already gone, but Leo was still within reach. She reached the loading dock doors and peered through the wired glass. The black van was idling, its exhaust plumes white in the cold night air. The 2 men were sliding the side door shut. Sarah knew she couldn't take them both in an open field with just a handgun and no backup. She needed an equalizer. She looked up at the school's industrial fire suppression system. A massive red pipe ran along the ceiling of the loading dock. She remembered the school's blueprints. That pipe was pressurized and connected to a high-capacity tank. She aimed Miller's Glock and fired 3 rounds into the main valve assembly. The pipe burst with a deafening roar, spraying a high-pressure deluge of water and fire-retardant foam directly onto the van and the guards. The chaos was instant. The guards, blinded and hammered by the pressure of the spray, scrambled for cover. Sarah used the diversion to sprint toward the van. She reached the driver's side, shattered the window with the butt of her gun, and dragged the driver out before he could engage the transmission. She threw him to the ground and dived into the driver's seat. She slammed the van into reverse, the tires screeching as she backed away from the loading dock. She heard bullets thudding into the rear of the vehicle, but the reinforced plating held. "Leo!" she yelled over the roar of the water. From the back of a van, a muffled voice cried out. She drove the van around the corner of the building, parking it behind a row of yellow school buses to shield it from view. She climbed into the back and ripped the hood off Leo's head. The boy was hyperventilating, his face pale and eyes wide. "Miss Sarah? What's happening? You're shooting people," he gasped. "The history of the world is happening, Leo," she said, her voice steady but urgent. She cut his zip ties with a quick motion. "I need you to listen to me. They have Maya. They're moving her to a warehouse at the docks. I need you to take this burner phone. It's Gable's. I need you to bypass its GPS lockout and find the exact coordinates of secondary site B. Can you do that?" Leo looked at the phone, then at Sarah. He saw the gun, the foam-covered tactical gear, and the raw determination in her eyes. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Give me 2 minutes. I'm faster than their encryption." As Leo worked on the phone, Sarah monitored the school's exterior. She saw Thorne and Gable standing on the loading dock, looking at the wreckage of the fire pipe. Thorne was on his radio, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage. Sarah knew they would be calling in reinforcements. Aegis Strategic Solutions didn't play small. She needed to find Maya and finish this before the school was swarmed by a private army. "I got it," Leo whispered. "The GPS coordinates are for an old canning factory on Pier 17. But Miss Sarah, there's something else. The phone just received an encrypted file. It's labeled Final Solution, Oak Ridge." Sarah took the phone. The file was a digital kill switch. If the operation was compromised, Thorne had the ability to wipe all student records, trigger a gas leak in the chemistry wing, and blame the entire tragedy on a disgruntled student, likely Leo. It was the perfect cover-up.
"We can't go to the docks yet," Sarah said, her voice like flint. "If we leave now, they'll destroy the evidence and kill everyone still in the building to cover their tracks. We have to stop the kill switch." Leo shook his head. "It's being broadcast from a localized hub inside the school, somewhere with its own independent power supply." Sarah's eyes widened as she recalled a strange anomaly in the school's layout. Locker 402. Leo looked confused. "That's in the senior hall. It's been welded shut for years. Everyone says it was a prank." Sarah nodded. "It's not a locker. It's a disguised antenna housing. It's the heart of their communication array." They left the van and moved back into the school through a side entrance. The air was now heavy with the smell of ozone and something sharper. The gas leak had already been initiated. They reached the senior hall, and there it was, a battered locker with a service out of order sign. Sarah didn't try to pick it. She used the last of her strength to kick the door inward, the metal groaning as the weld snapped. Inside was a high-frequency transmitter and a small laptop. Leo dived for the keys, his fingers moving like a blur. "I'm in. I'm stopping the gas flow. But Thorne is already here, Miss Sarah. He's right behind you." Sarah turned. Principal Thorne was standing at the end of the hall, a heavy-caliber pistol in his hand. He wasn't smiling anymore. "You always were too smart for your own good, Agent Miller," Thorne said. Sarah froze. He used her real name. "I thought you died in that drone strike in Damascus, but here you are, playing teacher. It's a shame. You could have been a partner." Sarah stepped in front of Leo, shielding him. "The only thing I'm teaching tonight, Thorne, is how to fail, and you're about to get a failing grade."
Thorne laughed, a dry, rattling sound that echoed in the hallway. "You're out of your depth. Aegis owns this town. Even if you stop the gas, the girls are already on the boat. Maya Vance is a memory." He raised his gun, but before he could pull the trigger, the school's PA system crackled to life. It wasn't music or an announcement. It was the sound of Thorne's own voice from the server room, detailing the shipment for the Vegas hub. Leo had patched the recording Sarah made into every speaker in the building and, more importantly, to the local police frequency. Thorne's eyes went wide with shock. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that was all Sarah needed. She didn't fire her gun. She threw her multi-tool with surgical precision, striking Thorne's wrist. His shot went wild, shattering a trophy case. Sarah closed the distance in 3 strides. She didn't fight like a teacher. She fought like a force of nature. She used Thorne's own momentum to slam him against the lockers, then delivered a series of rapid-fire strikes to his ribs and throat. He collapsed, gasping for air. Sarah didn't kill him. She pinned him to the floor, her knee on his neck. "Where is the boat?" she hissed. "Pier 17, the Northern Star." Thorne wheezed, blood at the corner of his mouth. "But you'll never make it. My men, they're already at the perimeter. You're a dead woman walking." Sarah looked at Leo. "Keep the recording playing on a loop. Make sure the police get every file on that server. Can you do that?" Leo nodded, his face determined despite his fear. "Go save Maya. I've got the school." Sarah grabbed Thorne's radio. "Miller's down. Thorne's down. This is Agent Sarah Miller. All Aegis assets stand down or be identified to the DOJ." She didn't wait for an answer. She sprinted out of the building, found her beat-up sedan, and floored it toward the docks. The drive was a blur of neon lights and adrenaline. She reached Pier 17 just as a massive industrial trawler began to pull away from the dock. She saw a black SUV parked at the edge of the pier. Gable, the counselor, was trying to make a clean break. Sarah didn't stop. She rammed her car into the SUV, sending it spinning toward the water. She jumped out before the impact, rolling onto the cold concrete. She saw a figure on the deck of the moving ship, a girl in a school hoodie. Maya. Sarah looked at the gap between the pier and the ship. It was 12 feet and growing by the second. She didn't think about the risk. She ran, her boots pounding the wood, and leaped into the dark, cold air over the water. Sarah slammed onto the metal deck of the Northern Star, the air leaving her lungs in a painful rush.
Two Aegis mercenaries turned, their rifles rising, but Sarah was faster. She stayed low, sweeping the legs of the first man and using his body as a shield as she fired at the second. It was over in seconds. She found Maya in a small cabin below deck, huddled with three other girls. They were terrified, but alive. "Miss Sarah?" Maya whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You came for us." Sarah holstered her weapon, her face softening for the first time. "Let's go home, Maya. History class starts at 8, and you've got an essay to finish." By dawn, the school was swarmed by federal agents, not the local police Thorne had in his pocket. Sarah had used her old emergency frequency to call in the one man in D.C. she still trusted. As the girls were reunited with their families, Sarah stood on the edge of the parking lot, watching the sunrise. Leo walked up to her, folding a caplet. "We did it," he said. "Thorne, Gable, the whole board of directors, they're all in custody. The locked room is empty." Sarah nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the horizon. "It's not over, Leo. This was just one school. Aegis is global, and they don't like losing." Then her phone buzzed. It was a private number. She answered it, expecting her contact in D.C. Instead, a voice she hadn't heard in 5 years spoke, a voice that made her blood run cold. "Well done, Sarah. You cleaned up Thorne's mess quite nicely. He was becoming a liability." Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled. "You know who I am. I'm the one who gave you this job. I'm the one who kept you safe in that little school for 3 years. Did you really think you were hiding? Oak Ridge was never a school, Sarah. It was a testing ground for you. We needed to see if you still had the edge after all this time." Sarah looked back at the school building. She saw the locked room window on the basement level. A cold realization washed over her. The entire operation, the trafficking, the corruption, it hadn't just been a crime. It had been an elaborate live fire exercise designed by her former agency to recruit her back into the fold. Thorne had been a pawn. The victims were real, but the stakes had been manipulated. "I'm out," Sarah said, her voice a low growl. "I don't work for you anymore." The voice on the other end went quiet for a moment. "Oh, Sarah, look at the locket you found. Look at the back." Sarah pulled the silver locket from her pocket. On the reverse side, tiny letters were engraved. Subject number 001, Sarah Miller, property of Project Horizon. She wasn't the hunter. She was the original ghost, and the locked room was just the beginning of her new cage.